Good morning, and thanks for joining us for the Microsoft Security Tech Talk on 3 steps to protect your organization from ransomware. Hi, my name's Patrick, and I'm the marketing manager here at Softworks. A bit about ransomware, as I'm sure a lot of us are already aware, it's becoming more and more hazardous, and that's largely due to the increasing sophistication of attacks. For example, attackers have evolved beyond the simple crypto locker attacks of the 1990s and the 2000s, and these days are using things like toolkits and affiliate business models to really maximize the potential damage as well as the potential earnings from an attack. This type of sophistication and collaboration between criminal gangs has really grown ransomware into a large threat for businesses across the globe, with over 250 million pounds of ransomware payments made in 2020 alone. And in fact, the frequency of ransomware attacks has increased dramatically over the past few years, with almost a doubling of attacks at 93% more ransomware attacks carried out in the first half of 2021 than in the same period in last year. And that's according to a Checkpoint's mid-year security report. So the issue of ransomware is something every organization should be prepared for, and that's exactly what today is about. So it's if it's the first tech talk that you've attended, I'll just explain a little bit about that. They're designed to keep your organization on top of the latest Microsoft security stack so that you stay ahead of the curve and that you can adapt to threats as they emerge by using the latest Microsoft security tools. And these webinars are free technical workshops, so apologies in advance if the language gets a bit technical and Matt starts speaking in binary, but they are semi-structured. They'll include some slides and often demo environments. They actually happen once a month on the third Tuesday, which we call Tech Talk Tuesday. And so far we've covered hot topics like Defender for Microsoft 365, Azure Sentinel, Cloud App Security, and Zero Trust. And you can actually catch up on all of those either on our YouTube channel or you can find them on our website. Just a quick intro on Softworks. Softworks has been a Microsoft Gold partner for 20 years. If you don't know us, we're based in Cambridge and London, and we're a leading cloud Microsoft security provider. We help organizations across the UK and Europe secure their businesses through the design and deployment of end-to-end Microsoft security and compliance. And now I'm really excited to introduce Matt, our presenter. He's our senior Microsoft security architect here at Softworks, and when he's not designing the next level of advanced Microsoft security infrastructure, he actually loves touring in classic BMWs. I think the limit is 500 quid he's allowed to spend on a trip on a BMW that's supposed to get him all across the continent and beyond sometimes. So that's just a bit about Matt. He joined Softworks in 2010, and he's designed and successfully launched our 24/7 Microsoft Security Operations Center. And at this point, I'll hand you over to Matt, who can take you through the rest of the presentation. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Patrick. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So as Patrick said, we're going to have a little look today at what I think you should be considering are the sort of 3 critical areas to ensure that you protect yourselves against kind of ransomware attacks. We'll have a look at what the technologies are that we tend to work with as a Microsoft partner, and I'll try and give you some tips and some examples as we go along. So we'll jump straight in. When we talk about these 3 key things that will protect your business, we're looking at kind of limiting your exposure, making it difficult for the threat to get in the first place, and also ensuring that we can recover from any particular event or a kind of malware or crypto type attack in a timely fashion. So the very first thing that we should all do is to prepare the organization so that we have a viable alternative to paying any kind of ransom should we be hit by some sort of crypto. It's important to remember that there's no security solution out there that gives you 100% guarantee. So we always need to plan to make sure that we could recover everything from scratch. And it should be obvious, but so many organizations neglect to check that their backups include everything, and even fewer know whether the backup itself is protected from being erased or encrypted, if you are subject to some sort of crypto malware getting into the organization. Another thing that's often kind of overlooked, and it's quite a significant piece, is where you keep the documentation that guides you through the recovery process. Over the years, I've been involved in these kind of scenarios where we're called in because the event has already happened and we've got to try and help a client kind of recover back to where they were. And it's of absolutely no use if all that documentation on how the recovery procedure was supposed to run is sat on the systems that are being protected by the backup. You've got to have a means to manage that and get access to that document when you really need it. So what are the practical steps that we can take to ensure that we have a robust backup? And this is kind of where some of my tips and things will start to come in. Using some form of kind of online immutable storage, things like Azure blob storage containers, or the Azure backup and site recovery service will isolate that backup data from the live environment. There's no direct connection whereby any compromise of your live environment could then spread out to that online storage platform. And in terms of protecting that online storage platform, adding some sort of privileged identity check or just a simple 2FA in front of the Azure portal in this example can enhance the security of your backup data. And it's really simple to implement something like that using conditional access. So you can get a quick win by using cloud storage as well to speed up the recovery of an individual laptop. Think of a scenario where a machine itself has been compromised and you need to quarantine and isolate that. You'll leave that user in a situation where they can't continue to work. Potentially they've lost access to what they had on that local machine. So a really simple quick win there is to move their personal data into an online storage service like OneDrive or SharePoint. That way, if you do need to quarantine and isolate that machine, they can continue working from another device and still have access to that data that otherwise might have been stored locally on the machine. Having said that, you should always consider the recovery process for your cloud storage services. Just because the provider includes an SLA doesn't mean you're covered if a compromised laptop gets encrypted and subsequently encrypts everything that's in Dropbox or OneDrive or SharePoint. So you need a means to recover that data as well, and you should protect yourself in the same way you would file shares and machines and systems. So looking at products like Carbonite or Veeam, they have options that allow you to perform backups of those online providers. And again, putting it into that kind of immutable separate storage where there's no direct kind of cross-link access to that storage is very important to ensure that you've got that recoverability and it can't be compromised. So let's have a quick little look at Azure Recovery Services, and I'll just give you an example of how we can use the conditional access service with Azure. So we're going to dive in, and hopefully the demo gods will work with us today and have a little look at Azure Backup Services. So I'm going to go into the Azure portal here, and then to sort of emphasize the fact that this is the right way to do it, you want to put this additional checks and controls and a sort of privileged account access in front of your Azure environment. So I'm going to sign in here with a separate account that has the access to our Azure service. I'm just going to pop my password into this, so bear with me 1 second. And then what it's going to do, because I've selected to access the Azure service, I've put this 2FA process in front of it. So I have to perform a 2FA check against that, just for the purpose of accessing the environment where that backup exists. And I'll show you how we achieved that. Oops, sorry. So here in the Azure portal, setting up a recovery service vault or storage for your backups offsite couldn't be any simpler than creating a resource. I've got a recovery service vault in here that I'm going to show you, just to give you a bit of an idea of how simple it is to connect things to these environments, and actually how kind of cost effective it is compared to building out your own recovery system on site with local storage or off-site storage. So creating a recovery service vault gives you this kind of immutable container. It's all based around the Azure storage system, and then on top of that, you then connect to the various services that you want to perform the backup against. So it splits into two areas, and this comes down to the kind of speed of response to be able to get those services back up and running. From a backup point of view, it's as simple as selecting where the system is. So if they're Azure servers, that's quite straightforward to set up. It's all kind of built into the platform. If it's an on-premise system or your own system that you want to perform a separate backup of, it's simply a case of selecting the type of backup that you want to perform. So I'm going to capture everything from the machine, and the service will guide you through downloading an agent that goes into each of the servers and configuring it to perform the backup and place that data into the recovery service vault for you. And then in terms of doing a restore out of that, you've got the items that are protected, so the machines that you've got copies of, and it would just be a case of selecting a particular machine. The system will then query for available backups for it. Pick a different one there, see if I've got an in. Here we go. Selecting the particular backup you want, and then you can choose the recover the whole image. If it's an Azure VM, you can get the image out of it that way, or possibly if you're doing backups of Hyper-V from on site, then you can get the image back out of it that way, or a simple file recovery, which is a lot similar to just mounting the backup image locally and then extracting the files from it. So you'd run this process on the machine where you want to get the files from. So it's very simple to maintain, very simple to access, and quick to retrieve individual backup files or kind of things from it should the worst happen and you'd be affected by crypto. Separately to that, if you've had some form of outage where you've lost whole machines and you need to bring those back up very quickly, then you've got this option to replicate or use site recovery. And if you've never experienced this in the Azure environment before, what this effectively is a way to take a complete copy of a virtual machine, so Hyper-V or VMware system from on-premise, and replicate the entire machine as is over to Azure. It maintains a constant replica of the disk changes into the Azure environment, and takes a snapshot of those at least every hour. So should you have a problem where you need to bring a machine back up, you can get the machine back up almost immediately within a matter of minutes, and you can have a copy of it from anything up to 48 hours ago, and you can pick on an hourly basis which hour you want to go back to from prior to when the compromise occurred, and that gets you an ability to bring entire data centers or entire environments back up very quickly in an Azure data center, and you only need to pay for the use of those VMs when you bring them up and have them running. So really, I just want to highlight there that you've got this capability in Azure around recovery service vaults. If you've not looked into it before, it's definitely well worth taking a look at. It can really reduce the amount of downtime or the impact should a crypto event occur. Now, you saw me sign in there, and it prompted me for a 2FA challenge when I went into the Azure portal. So just a quick tip on kind of a very simple way that you can implement that from your Azure Active Directory. When you're in the Active Directory service, in your security settings, you've got the conditional access capability. And a very quick way to just add or increase the level of protection in front of the ability to access the Azure portal and get to those backups is just to create a policy in here. You can quite happily target all users, because it would make sense that anybody who has access to the Azure platform should always go through some level of additional check, and then you can just target that to the Azure management portal in here, and under the grant controls, I would recommend, as a sort of minimum, you want to make sure that they have to go through a multi-factor authentication check. If you've got other conditional access rules in place, then this will layer on top of those, so it will be an additional check for them. And it's typically a good idea in these sort of scenarios to set a session-based control as well. And that's to ensure that if somebody signs in with this privileged level of access, you want to ensure that they don't leave that signed in on that machine, or kind of store that credential locally. And then anybody who could subsequently get access to that machine might be able to skip the MFA check because it's cached for however many days on that particular machine. So a good idea is to set kind of maybe 1 working day, or kind of 4 to 8 hours, maybe 6 hours, so that you just time out that session, and then that ensures that the next time somebody tries to, or that person tries to access the Azure environment, they are re-prompted for their 2FA check. So a couple of little tips there, just around a quick and easy way to get an offsite secure immutable backup in place and protect access to that particular account. So next in our kind of 3 steps, we've got our ability to recover in place, is to kind of prevent a bad actor from escalating their privilege if they were to get into the system. So this is all about kind of building on top of more and more layers of control to ensure that we've protected ourselves as best we can. So the focus here is to really ensure that any of your users in a day-to-day scenario, whether it's your system admins or your backup managers or whoever it is, that their kind of access to your system doesn't automatically give them access to those roles that administer your systems. Also, kind of just thinking back to that and the example I gave, your backup and recovery services. So it's not just your admin roles, but you want to make sure that day to day, the system admins or the IT support staff can't just use their account to authenticate directly to the storage or the software or the system that holds your backups. Because in doing that, if your help desk user's account was compromised, then potentially all of your backup and any other services that their account is allowed access to could be compromised at the same time. So in addition to limiting our exposure here, we also need a robust way to identify and respond to events that take place around the systems that we run. And the goal with that is to identify a problem as early as possible before it really becomes a threat, and to try and mitigate it. So in terms of limiting our scope, it's sort of a 2-part approach. It's reducing the possibility of a compromised account from being used to kind of further gain access and compromise us more, and separately to identify as soon as possible if we think something like this is going on, or it looks like somebody's trying to compromise account, and we want to hit that as early as possible before it really becomes a threat. So the practical steps we would take to achieve these is, first off, to implement conditional access. If any of you have watched some of my other presentations, I do bang on about conditional access a lot. It is key to so many parts of your security strategy and your zero trust strategy. So at least have conditional access rules in place for all your administrative users and their roles. And use it also, if you can, to limit which devices can be used for administration. And as I did in my example there, always enforce 2FA against those administrative roles, or if they are kind of like global admins, the user account itself. So you want to define this kind of what we tend to call a privileged identity management strategy. So that's all I'm using the term there for, is to describe the process by which your IT staff gain access to the administrative roles. Now in Azure AD, we have the privileged identity management function that allows us to isolate the administration of each individual service. So your IT team or your help desk team may have to re-verify their credential when they go from performing password resets to managing an Exchange mailbox, for example, or gaining access to the SharePoint management service. But it's largely for PIM in Azure AD is around the services that authenticate or federate with Azure Active Directory. But if you can't do that, or you know, the PIM function is a licensed feature, there is just a very simple way that you can separate these functions out, and that's just by ensuring that your IT staff have separate admin accounts to their day-to-day accounts, and use conditional access there to impose much stricter restrictions on that particular account. You know, if you don't have the luxury of using the PIM service in Azure AD, at the very least, separate out those accounts. Don't allow your IT staff's day-to-day accounts to be global admins or Exchange admins, or whatever the function is that they're doing. You should also consider a privileged access management setup. Now, these things are often confused together with PIM. So PIM versus PAM, privileged identity management, versus privileged access management. The simplest way, or the best way I can describe it, is when we talk about privileged identity management, we're talking about gaining access to an administrative role, so which has a whole host of functions that can be performed. Whereas privileged access management is more concerned with authorizing the ability to perform a certain task. So an example of a privileged access management task might be creating a new inbox rule. And I use that one because that's a favorite of anyone trying to gain access to somebody else's mailbox, and they're typically trying to do that so they can impersonate them. And we hear a lot of these sort of in the press with these phishing attempts where somebody's password is obtained, they get into the mailbox, they add an inbox rule, forward a copy of everything to themselves, and then kind of try and impersonate that individual and get somebody senior in finance to sign off on something, you know, to try and extract funds or something from the organization. So privileged access management, or PAM, is all about controlling those individual tasks versus controlling the kind of overarching administrative role that the user might need. And you put the two together to get a kind of granular control over what's going on. So let's just have a quick look at a couple of these examples in the Office 365 or the Microsoft 365 environment. So for privileged identity management, I mentioned it's part of Azure AD and it is a licensed feature. You'll find that in the Azure Active Directory console under Identity Governance. There's lots of different ways that you can implement privileged identity management. It's not just about the roles within Azure AD. It can be linked to kind of any service that you federate with Azure. And there's a whole mechanism in this system that you can use for self-service access management, so people can come and request the use of a package of roles for a period of time. We won't go into all of that right now. That's quite an involved presentation, but we will go through those with you. If you want to, just feel free to get in touch. What I want to show you here is just a very simple thing that you can do using the privileged identity management for your Azure Active Directory roles. In these menus here under assignments, you can then provide either eligible or active assignments to a role. So most of you are probably used to, why that's giving me a message, live demo there. Let's see if it will reload. Here we go. Most of you are used to assigning global admin rights or Exchange admin rights or maybe Teams admin rights. What the privileged identity management does is allow you to create an assignment through here where the individual is eligible for the use of that role. So we can pick any of the many roles from Azure AD, let's say Teams Administrator for this particular example, and we specify who's going to have that capability, or who's going to be allowed to use this. And then we set in here whether they are eligible for it or it's an active assignment. And by using the eligible capability, when we assign that to that particular person, they can come into the privileged identity management portal and request the use of that role for a period of time. And we define what these periods of time are, or how these roles can be used kind of on a role by role basis. So if I was to take that Teams administrator role again, or use Teams device admin for this, I can say how long they're allowed to use that for, and what sort of additional checks do I need to go through. So is a person going to approve their ability to use that, and who are those people who are going to approve it? Do I need them to do an extra 2FA check when the assignment becomes active? Do I need them to give a reason why they're going to use it? And also, who's going to be notified? So it's kind of an audit trail as well of who gets access to that service. So that's privileged identity management, and it's a means of not providing that user account with permanent use of that role, but giving them a way to go and request the use of it, activate it themselves. Maybe somebody has to check it for them before they're allowed to, but it's putting that barrier up so that anybody who's potentially breached that user account or a compromised user account can't just be used to perform an admin function without an additional check. In privileged access management on Office 365, to be specific, we administer those through the admin center. So you can find this in here. You'll need to go into the settings menu and your org settings, and under privacy and security in here, you've got a privileged access function. This is a feature of the E3 and E5 subscriptions, so it's not included in every subscription, but I'll show you kind of how this works. When you perform a privileged access control, when a privileged access control is applied, what it's going to do is send an approval to somebody else to authorize that person or these people to perform the function. So you'd have a group of people who are going to approve the use of the functions that are in the list of roles, and then we create policies for which functions we want to monitor and pass through the request for access. So I'll give you an example here. We're going to perform a task. There might be a particular role, like if they're doing like e-discovery or something, they might need a whole kind of set of task capabilities, so they'd be in a role. And at the moment in Microsoft 365, these policies only apply to Exchange, and I know Microsoft are working on adding extra controls into this service. So when we set this kind of control over this capability, and to use our example, somebody creating a new inbox rule against another user, so an administrative change to inbox rules, we could set in here that your individuals, your admins need to request the ability to perform new inbox roles, and when they request that ability, they're allowed to do it for the next 2 hours. For example, you can give them a reason why they need to give the request, and then create it in there. And then going forward, your admins come into the access request portal and they request the use of that function. So very brief, there's a lot more involved in how that works, but I just wanted to give you just a little insight into the difference between privileged identity management and privileged access management, and just try and make sure that that's clear. And it's a good idea to try and implement both in your environment. Again, just limit that ability for somebody, should an account be compromised, to start performing admin functions that further compromise your environment. Now, last but by no means least, is the ability to be able to detect and respond to events. It's critical to being able to limit our exposure. And what we're talking about here is using things like extended detection and response tools. Microsoft 365 Defender and Azure Sentinel give us these sort of capabilities, and we use them to centrally analyze all our devices and all the interactions that our users have with those devices and our services. What we're looking for are things like brute force password spray attempts, maybe like anonymous or impossible user events, the clearing of security event logs. That often means somebody's trying to hide what they've just done, you know, where kind of a bad actor or somebody kind of acting maliciously has got into a system. They're then going to try and hide what they just did so that they can sit there and wait and then come back and perform that kind of crypto event or whatever it is that they're going to try and do at a later date, so you're less aware of them. Also, disabling of security tools, we kind of definitely want to know about those. And there's a whole host of analytics that we can perform when we've got all of those security events collated centrally to be able to run those analytics rules over. Now, I've got a couple of different presentations in this series, one on the Microsoft XDR and Defender for Endpoint, and there's another one on Azure Sentinel itself. So check those out. If that's something that you want to understand a bit more about, then please do get in touch. As Patrick alluded to at the start, it's a big part of our business now, and yeah, it's a very popular service from Microsoft to get these kind of Sentinel system up and running. It's also relatively inexpensive way to build a kind of SIEM solution and to get that kind of a cross-platform analysis of what's going on and kind of head off these potential problems before they occur. Now, the last of our kind of 3 steps is to try and make it as difficult as possible for those bad actors to get into our on-premise or cloud infrastructure in the first instance. So things that we really should kind of look at, or things that we should focus on. First up, always remote access. If you provide client VPN or software VPN connections to your users, whatever you do, make sure they're protected by 2FA. VPN connections are quite a broad, open threat. We tend to call them threat vectors, but it's a path or a channel, a way that a compromised laptop can get access to large network segments in our data center, or possibly even the entire network environment in the building of an office. So you really want to consider whether you actually need that VPN at all, or do you need it for all applications. You want to limit your exposure wherever you can here, and things like the Azure AD application proxy might be something that you want to take a look at. We did look at Azure AD app proxy in one of the previous presentations, so again, go back and watch that if you want to see a bit of detail on those. What it basically does is allows you to pass a secure proxied web connection to an internal service or system, having pre-authenticated the user in conditional access, so we can make them jump through all those hoops and checks around the device and maybe like 2FA and things. And there was never any need to open a VPN. We didn't expose large sections of the network. We gave them kind of one specific port on one specific server that we'd already kind of double checked who they were before they got access to it. So remote access, definitely something that you want to look at as a kind of priority. For a VPN access that admins are using, especially if it's virtual machines or systems that are in Microsoft Azure, then if you've never seen it before, have a look into a service called Azure Bastion. It's like a jump box or a gateway into your virtual machines. Again, sits behind conditional access, so we can put all of those checks and rules in place, and again eliminates the need to open up whole segments of networks. It's just a quick way in a browser to drop your admin users straight onto the remote desktop session or the console session of the VMs that they're administering through the browser without opening all those ports and without potentially exposing that environment to whatever's going on those local PCs. Now, email security is a fairly well covered topic, and hopefully everyone has some level of protection in place. So there's just a few things that I want to kind of raise here that you should really consider when we think about making it difficult to compromise email services. Think about those PAM rules. If you've got the license to do it, then use those to mitigate any potential compromise of an admin account. PAM and PIM hand in hand together will dramatically reduce the potential for a compromised administrator account to cause you a problem. If you haven't looked at Defender for Office 365, I thoroughly recommend it. It has base policy templates that will provide you with a quick and comprehensive deployment of a whole suite of protection features, from phishing attempts to your kind of typical anti-spam and your malware detection. And it ties very nicely into the Microsoft Security Center. We do also have a video on the channel that takes you through some of the features and how you might use those. Also, check out the attack surface reduction features in Windows 10. It's a Windows 10 thing. You deploy it to the PCs, and you do it through Intune or through group policy, but it can effectively, really effectively block things like credential theft and ransomware activity. And in relation to email, it's that injection of processes initiated by Office apps. I'm thinking Outlook, stuff that comes in on an email that maybe got through every filter and every check, and then the user opened it. If that was then going to try and run or perform some sort of process change on their PC to compromise the PC, those attack surface reduction features, pretty simple to implement. Windows 10 has them in it. It's just a case of making sure that they're on and enforced, and whether you're Intune managed or group policy managed in Active Directory, you can control all of those same features through either method. So definitely take a look into that. Now, from an endpoint point of view, we want to be thinking about how to maintain a security baseline across the organization. Intune has a pretty comprehensive policy that comes out of the box. So if you don't already have one, that's a good place to start with. What this is about is ensuring that all of those security settings that Windows has built in, again, like the attack surface reduction policies, are set and configured in a standard way so that you haven't missed any systems. You've got a kind of catch-all across the environment using something like Intune or group policy. But as well as that, we also want to make sure that we keep all our software and operating systems up to date, and we need to employ a means to assess all the devices for that purpose. Now, Defender for Endpoint has a fantastically simple way to report on all your software versions, and it will show you kind of not only which software packages you've got that have vulnerabilities in it, but it will break it down device by device. And again, we have got an example on our channel that you can go back and watch, and you'll see in a kind of reasonable amount of detail how you can use that device assessment and that vulnerability assessment piece to see where you need to reinforce your patch management strategy or your patch management software that you're using to keep those versions of browsers and all the other applications that are out there up to date and stop them from being the vulnerable part in the chain around the device. And finally, we've got our user accounts. So I'm not sure I can emphasize this enough. The vast majority of compromises come from phishing events or weak passwords. A robust MFA strategy is kind of the lowest common denominator, the most important thing that you can have for your organization, because if you can prevent the accounts from being compromised, then you're kind of halfway there to preventing the device from being compromised and any content being compromised that user has access to. The conditional access is key because it minimizes the impact on the users. I think most of us have done some kind of MFA deployment somewhere along the lines, and it's that balance of the impact on the user versus the security for the environment. And conditional access here will allow you to kind of simultaneously increase the protection that you apply to your users, as well as making it simpler and minimizing the impact of MFA on them. So a well-designed set of conditional access rules is kind of crucial to that zero trust model and reducing the impact of all these extra security controls on your users' day-to-day kind of working environment. And my last tip for this presentation is if you've got Active Directory and haven't extended something called Azure AD password protection to your AD accounts, have a look into it. It's well published on docs.microsoft.com. It's a really quick and simple deployment process. It goes onto your domain controllers and it will allow you to check for simple passwords or accounts that might be easily compromised using the same rule set that Azure Active Directory does for its password protection, but applying it to your on-premise servers and systems. So really simple things that you can do to improve your posture against protecting from ransomware or malware getting into the environment. So to kind of start to summarize, and I've actually managed to hit this on time with the 45 minutes, ensure that you've got a well-tested recovery process. There's no better way to mitigate or to deal with a compromise than just to be able to rapidly delete, shred, get rid anything that might have been compromised and restore it. So if your recovery process is quick, simple, well tested, well documented, easily accessible and out of band of the environment that might have been compromised, that's key to being able to recover from this and to not have to pay or to be at the mercy of ransomware of kind of bad actors using ransomware. I would encourage you all to understand the difference between PIM and PAM. It gets confused a lot, and think about how you could implement a strategy, even if it's just at the simplest level of separating out day-to-day IT users accounts from IT admin accounts. This is fairly stock standard stuff that we should all have been doing for years, but over time with the introduction of online services where it just was easy to be a global admin in Office 365, some of that has slipped. So go back and review that, look at it and make sure that you've got a clear strategy and everybody understands it. Use those things like the attack surface reduction features in Windows 10 and Windows 11 now, for those of you who've taken that leap last week. They're there, the features are built into Windows. It's just a case of getting yourself a policy, be it through Intune or group policy, to enforce them, make sure they're in place, make sure that they are strictly controlled and being applied. They're a great way to minimize the risk on the device. and then have that means to be able to identify where the devices are vulnerable or where you have software vulnerabilities across the organization. Knowing what's going on and having a picture of what the day-to-day looks like will give you a far greater kind of ability to mitigate against what potential threats are out there. If you don't know how far out of date all the software is around your business, or worse still, what all the software is that's out there across the organization, then you're really going to struggle to minimize the risk across those devices and for those users. So I'll begin to kind of wrap this up here. I always say this at the end, please do get in touch if you've got any specific scenarios that you want to go through, and if you've got any kind of questions specific to any of the topics that we've covered, whether it's from this event or any other event, we'll just have a quick look into the Q&A and see what questions that we've got coming through here. So there's a question here: are these recovery services available for Office 365? So I think by that we're looking at things like the Azure recovery service. Microsoft don't provide their own environment or a backup of that model within Azure. If you're looking for something that would use the equivalent of immutable storage like the Azure blob storage to perform those kind of regular backups to protect mailboxes, SharePoint, Teams, all those kind of content areas, then I would look at products like the Carbonite service. That's a kind of no effort on your part configuration. It's all SaaS delivered and driven by them as a provider. If you want something that fits into an existing strategy and you're backing up VMs on site, a lot of you are probably using Veeam, so that tends to be a good go-to because it's got very simple extensions that will allow it to perform backups against storage and mailboxes in Office 365. There's one other question in here, just says, how do we sign up? I'm not sure if that's regarding things like our security ops service or for future presentations. Either way, if you want any information around our future services, info@softworks.com to join the list to be notified about future events and anything else that our team are putting together. You can find us on our LinkedIn page or on the softworks.com website. Everything's published on there for you to be able to sign up for any future events. I think that's the end of the questions that we've got on here. So I think that just leaves me to say we have a little survey that we post in the Q&A. So if you have time, it literally takes 1 minute just to give us some feedback. If you could follow that link and do that for me, that'd be great. Yeah, if you want to see any more of the workshops or go back and find any of those previous presentations, again, there's a link in the Q&A, or it's softworks.com/discover will take you to that content. Thank you very much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again in the future.